Hey everyone, Mr. Birch here. Today we're going to be doing the Sectionalism study guide in your survivor's guide. So make sure you have your printed STAAR test survivor's guide in front of you. Just have a pen or pencil, highlighter, marker, something so that you can be making notes on it as we go along. Today we're going to be talking about sectionalism. That's the era after the Jackson era and before the Civil War. So there's a lot to talk about here today, so let's get right into it. First few slides are going to be going over the packet together, and then the last slides are going to be going over all STAAR test questions that have ever been asked over sectionalism or the antebellum period, okay? So we're going to be going through those questions really quickly today because there's a lot of them, and the reason there's a lot is because the STAAR test has asked a lot of questions over this period, so make note of that. This is very important. We're going to be going through these questions really quickly today. You might want to press pause after I ask the question so that you have time to look over it, answer it yourself, and then press play again, because I'm not going to give you much time. On your STAAR test, you have 4 hours to answer 52 questions, so you'll have plenty of time on the STAAR test, but today we're going to be moving quickly. All right, so with that said, let's get going. All right, so we're going to skip right down here. We're going to go past the Monroe Doctrine and look at Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny plays a big role in the sectionalism era because Manifest Destiny is the idea that we would span from sea to shining sea. Our country that started on the East Coast with the 13 original colonies, we had this desire to grow from the East Coast all the way over to the West Coast, and this was our destiny, that we would manifest our whole country from Pacific Ocean in the west and Atlantic Ocean in the east and everything in between. So a big part of this was, first we won the American Revolution, right? We have the 13 colonies, the original colonies, the Ohio River Valley, and then the third president, Thomas Jefferson, got the Louisiana Purchase, which is a big chunk of land in the center part of the U.S. Then in 1845, Texas became part of the Union. That sparked a war with Mexico over Texas and all the lands in the southwest of the United States: California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and a little bit of Colorado and some other areas there. But that was the Mexican War. Because of President Polk, we ended up going to war with Mexico. We fought them, gained that land. Mexican cession is when Mexico ceded or gave us all of that land after the war. We actually purchased it, but we kind of forced it. All right, so that's Manifest Destiny. Talking about immigration, Irish immigrants came because of the potato famine, and from the 1820s on, the potato famine was actually a little bit later, but the 1820s on, the Irish immigrated mostly to the Northeast in big cities, urban areas. They were Catholic, and many of the Irish worked in factories, some of them even on the Erie Canal, and big projects or urban areas in the Northeast mostly. Chinese immigrants, well, China is west of the United States across the Pacific Ocean, so Chinese immigrated to the west side of the United States, mainly in places like California, and a lot of them worked on the expansion projects like railroads. And then African slaves, we know that. We've talked about them plenty, but they didn't come over on their own choosing. They were forced over here. Most of them worked in the South. Slavery is a big part of the sectionalism era. We're going to be talking about that as far as how it relates to expansionism and the new states. So let's continue moving on. We're not going to talk about Andrew Jackson, the Indian Removal Act, or Nullification Crisis. We'll keep that as part of the Jacksonian era. But moving on to the bottom right, you see the greenish little circle. Texas gained independence from Mexico. The Texians lost the Battle of Alamo, and then shortly thereafter, they won the Battle of San Jacinto in 1836, beating Santa Anna and his Mexican troops and gaining independence from Mexico for Texas. Well, Mexico didn't really recognize that independence very well, but they were their own country. Texas was the Republic of Texas for about 10 years, but in 1845, they joined the Union. So in 1845, Texas became part of the United States. It became the state of Texas. Here's the thing to note about Texas. It became a slave state. It was in the South. It was a slave state. All right, during the early or mid 1800s, people were moving to cities because factory work and opportunities caused them to move from rural areas to urban areas. People were moving also out west because there was a lot of land and a lot of opportunity, maybe even for riches. Places like California in 1849, there was the gold rush. The 49ers were the men who traveled all the way across the country to get to California in search of gold. There was a lot of other minerals and ores and precious metals discovered out in Nevada, in the Dakotas, Colorado, and in the western states. So people were moving there for riches and land and just this adventure opportunity to gain and acquire new territory. There was also this, what helped in some of this transportation was new technology. Things like trains and steamboats made travel faster, easier, and cheaper so that goods and products could travel faster, easier, and cheaper. And then with communication increasing with the invention of the telegraph, thanks to Samuel Morse and the Morse code, tapping basically, this increased speed of communication as well. So the thing to remember here is that sectionalism is talking about different sections of our country, right? It's starting to section off. We have the West as the big, open, expansive new territory, and new states are beginning to be acquired in the West. And then you have the North, the original North, and then the original South. So the North we want to associate mostly with factories, numerous fast-flowing rivers, and dense urban cities. The South, plantations, fertile soil, cash crops, and slavery. And then the West, expansion, so this growing of new territory and new states, mining, minerals, ore, and as I said before, new states. Okay, so talking about industrialization and its role in expansion. So industrialization, it actually started in the late 1700s and going through the 1800s. The U.S. saw a rapid growth in factories, business, interchangeable parts. That's the ability to manufacture large quantities of things and interchange the parts in order to produce things faster and more efficiently. Again, part of the factory systems of the North or the Midwest up in there in the kind of northeast part of current United States. Productivity increased, transportation became better, and there were new technologies. So railroad and Western expansion. The railroads best express the manifest destiny dreams of America because the railroads allowed us eventually to, the transcontinental railroad allowed us to go from the east all the way to the west. They began spreading across the United States from east to west starting in the early 1820s. Is when the railroads really began to take off. It wasn't until many years later that they expand all the way to the west. So gold rush, we already talked about this, the 49ers. It was right after the Mexican War, which ended in 1848. Conveniently enough, the next year, 1849 was discovered. Gold was discovered in California, and a rush of men went out there to try to gain riches for themselves. Another thing about expansion, well, the Erie Canal, it really wasn't expanding new land, because the Erie Canal was in the far northeast in New York State. But it did allow for faster and easier transportation because it cut a water route from the Great Lakes in the Midwest area. By the way, the Midwest is actually in the northeast part of the United States, so don't get confused on that. But we call it the Midwest. It can be confusing. So the Great Lakes connected, because of the Erie Canal, all the way to New York City, which really grew the city of New York City. Well, because we could move goods and products and people up and down this canal very, very quickly. And because of that, it was cheaper to sell and buy products. Okay, factories and industry. Again, this started in the late 1700s. And the Lowell Mills factories were in Massachusetts, but Massachusetts, New Jersey, some of these New England, northeastern states started having a lot more factories. Again, fast-flowing rivers, able to put water mills in there, which would turn and generate power. There were textile mills. Textile just means cloth, so they were spinning. A lot of the people that worked in these textile mills were women and children. Okay, Eli Whitney, he invented the cotton gin in 1793. The cotton gin allowed to remove the seeds from the cotton much quicker, which allowed for be able to harvest more cotton quickly. You could remove the seeds from it quicker and then ship it up north, where in the north, in the textile mills, they would spin it into textiles or cloth, right? So because of the cotton gin, more slaves were needed, or were desired anyway, in order to be more profitable so you could harvest more cotton. The cotton gin could spin it quickly. You could ship it up north. And in the north, they could make their money by turning that cotton into cloth. The Mexican-American War, early 1800s, Mexico claimed much of the lands of present-day western United States. But because of President Polk's belief in manifest destiny, well, we sparked a war shortly after Texas joined the Union. It was actually in the lands bordering Texas and Mexico where this war started. And that war only lasted a couple short years, but after defeating Mexico, the United States, through the Mexican Cession, which is Mexico giving the land up after the war, we gained areas like California, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, Arizona, parts of Colorado, and parts of Wyoming. Okay, what is sectionalism? Sectionalism is the term used to describe the ever-widening gap between lifestyles, economics, traditions, politics, and beliefs between the North and the South mostly. The westward expansion really played a big role in this, and we'll talk about it. But this is based greatly on the thoughts towards slavery. We know that the northern states were mostly anti-slavery. There was a lot of the abolitionist movement was in the North. Abolitionist movement, abolition, we want to abolish slavery, right? In the South, it was more plantation system, a more traditional system. More of the Southerners wanted to retain slavery or keep slavery. Here's the thing, though. With this expanding westward movement of the United States, thanks to manifest destiny, well, these new states, they had to either be slave states or free states. And so the northern states were pulling for them to be free. The southern states were pulling for these new states to be slave. After the Mexican War ended, the U.S. had a lot of new landed territories were becoming states. I already talked about this, but there was a large, strong split emerging between slave and free state perspectives. And the new states found themselves in the middle of this fight. This fight for, well, are we going to be free or slave state? Antebellum period is what you'll hear this called sometimes. I haven't seen it on the test, I don't believe, but you might. Antebellum is the period leading up to and immediately before the Civil War. So that's kind of this same period, okay? So let's talk about how this pull of northern states wanting more states to be free, southern states wanting more states to be slave states. 1820 Missouri Compromise. The South wanted Missouri to be a slave state. The North wanted it to be a free state. Again, the same argument we find all the time. Well, Maine, way up there in the Northeast, was going to become a state too. So the compromise was that Maine would become a free state, and Missouri, which was a little bit further south, or lots further south, in fact, would become a slave state. Well, this Missouri Compromise established a line, a latitude line, which runs east and west horizontally across the continental United States, and that latitude line was at 30 degrees north, okay? So all you need to know is that this is the 3630 line. It split the country in half. Everything below that line was capable of becoming a slave state. Everything above that line was going to be a free state. So this kind of temporarily pacified this aggression between the two. As you can imagine, this did not last long. The Compromise of 1850, this is 30 years later, and this occurred after Mexican War. And the United States was growing. So here's what happened in the Compromise of 1850. A lot of things happened. 5 things, pretty much, are the main 5 points of the Compromise. California entered the United States. You see over there on the far left of your map, the pink state, California. It entered as a free state. Well, Texas, it shrunk down to its current size, but Texas was already a slave state. So Texas, big old Texas there in the middle, was a slave state. Big California there on the west side was a free state. Okay, Washington, D.C. on the far eastern side, it was no longer allowed to participate in the slave trade. So they couldn't buy and sell slaves, but they could still own slaves. So kind of murky territory there. Utah and New Mexico over there kind of by Texas and California in the new territory. They would become states, but they were popular sovereignty states. We'll talk about that in a second. And then the last thing is a pretty sad issue. It's the fugitive slave law. So they kind of strengthened the fugitive slave law with this compromise. And let's talk about those two things. So first, popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty was the law used in Utah, New Mexico, and then even Kansas and Nebraska. But this popular sovereignty law, it was the idea that a state's citizens should vote and decide within their own state if they should be free or slave state. So as this state is going to become, well, as this territory is going to now become a state as part of the United States, that territory, the people living within those borders would vote and decide themselves. So the popular vote, they would have their own sovereignty, which would mean they would rule their own land, and they would decide based on their own population, they would vote whether or not they would be a slave or free state. This ended up causing some violence in places like Kansas and Missouri because people were moving in and fighting for the free rights, and then some people were moving in and fighting for the slave rights, and they were fighting within these states. So some things were solved, many things were not. And then we have the Fugitive Slave Law, another part of the Compromise of 1850. The Fugitive Slave Law is a law that, well, fugitives that were once slaves, so escaped slaves that escaped from the South and ran to the northern free states, that didn't no longer mean that they were free just because they were in a free state. They were ex-slaves from the South who had ran away, and so this law said that Southerners were allowed to go up into the northern states and hunt and capture these slaves, or former slaves, or escaped slaves, however you want to look at it. And not only that, but many of the Northerners were forced, even if they did not believe in slavery, to participate in this slave capturing practice. Okay, so talking a little bit about slavery, the South. The South was home to slavery mostly because they were used on farms and big plantations, and mostly because they were used to produce cash crops. And the largest of all cash crops, where most of the slaves worked, was, well, it was cotton. And it was called king cotton in the South, actually, because cotton was king. No, everything else kind of bowed down to what cotton did. If cotton needed more slaves would come. If cotton needed this or that, cotton was king in the South. And slaves were a driving force of the cotton industry. So slavery was illegal in the North. Above that, you remember that Missouri Compromise line, the 3630 line? Above that line, slavery was illegal in those states. As more territory was acquired by the U.S., southern states fought to make them slave states. We know that. Well, the cotton gin, we already talked about it, created by Eli Whitney, removed the tiny seeds from the cotton, and this invention, because it made cotton production faster, made the demand for slaves to go up, and the profitability of slaves rose. Because now, if I can produce cotton faster, well, I'm a slave owner, I want to get more slaves to produce more cotton faster, thanks to the cotton gin. I need slaves to harvest that cotton, and now I can create more wealth for myself. So that's what was going on with the cotton gin. Well, slavery was the motivating factor for southern states to want to secede. Secede just means leave the Union, to leave the country, right? Well, slavery and the South also felt that their demands for state rights, they wanted more state rights, while many of the northern states wanted a more federal-run system. Well, their state right that they were fighting for the most was really the right for slavery. Triangular trade was the initial purchasing of slaves from Africa. We know that. Triangular trade was America, Europe, and Africa. If you kind of draw a line between those, it kind of forms the shape of a triangle. Goods and products and raw materials from America went to Europe and back and forth between the two, and Europeans went to Africa, got slaves, and brought them to America. That's the triangular trade, right? So let's talk about abolitionists. We already said this earlier. If you're an abolitionist, your desire is to abolish or end slavery. Quakers were the religious group that were the most prominent abolitionists. So the Quaker religion believed that their Christian beliefs, and they actually believed that all Christian beliefs, proved or told them that slavery was wrong. So John Brown, he was a famous white man who even murdered many people in an attempt to free the slaves. He even tried to break into federal lands and take storehouses of weapons and try to start a slave uprising. It didn't really work. He ended up killing a lot of people, and he and a lot of his people died in the fight, but it never really produced anything. But we may see him on the test. Frederick Douglass, he was a famous black writer and speaker, and he spoke on behalf of the blacks and the slaves in the United States. Harriet Beecher Stowe, she was a former slave. Harriet Beecher Stowe, she was the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. She was a white woman, and she wrote this fictional story called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Uncle Tom, he was a slave, and the story just documented his life being sold from one slave owner to another and then being put in hard times. And it showed the American people what slavery was really like and how desperate and terrible it really was. So, talking about another Harriet, we're going to talk about the Underground Railroad. It was not actually a railroad, by the way. So it's just kind of a metaphorical or symbolic name, the Underground Railroad. Underground just kind of symbolizing that it was kind of hidden and secretive because it wasn't underground. And railroad just kind of symbolizing that it was a journey or a way to get from one place to the other. Well, it was the name given to the secret passage and paths and ways in which slaves were escorted and helped from slave states to free states and eventually oftentimes all the way up to Canada. Because we know that the Fugitive Slave Act meant that even if these fugitive slaves escaped to the northern states, they weren't necessarily free. They could still be captured and brought back. Harriet Tubman was a famous former slave who actually went back, I think it was 11 different times, into slave states to save and deliver some of those people into freedom. And again, the Quakers often helped in the Underground Railroad because of their belief in the abolitionist movement. Okay, quickly, we're not going to start all the way at the top. We're going to look here, go down to 1820. Okay, you see the Missouri Compromise. It temporarily settled the slave-free state dispute by drawing a line at the latitude of 3630 with no new states above it being slave states. That started in 1820, right? Then you have the Monroe Doctrine, which said that America would not allow European powers to colonize anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, specifically South America. Then you got the Erie Canal in 1825. It's finished in 1825 anyway, connecting the Great Lakes to New York City. 1829, you have Andrew Jackson wins presidency. 1830, the Indian Removal Act because of Andrew Jackson, and then later the Trail of Tears. Nullification crisis in 1832 and 33. We're not talking about those today, but 1836, after losing the Battle of Alamo and then winning the Battle of San Jacinto, the Republic of Texas is confirmed, gaining independence from Mexico. 1837, you have the Panic of 1837 that involves the National Bank and Andrew Jackson, so we're not talking about that today. But in 1845, you have the Irish Potato Famine. This leads to a huge migration of Irish immigrants from Ireland to the United States, mostly in the Northeast. They were Catholics, and most of them were, and they worked in the northern industrial urban cities of the Northeast for the most part. Okay, Texas annexed in 1845. We said Texas gained its independence as a country in 1836. Well, about 9 or 10 years later, Texas becomes part of the United States as a slave state in 1845. President Polk, who is a very strong manifest destiny president, meaning he wants to gain all the land of North America, in 1846, Polk and the United States start the Mexican War. Well, in 1848, just a couple years later, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ends the war with Mexico, and Mexico's cession happens. That's where we gain all the lands of the Southwest. Well, 1849, that's gold's discovered, and we have the 49ers running out to California to search some of that gold and get rich. 1852, just a few years after Samuel Morse invented the telegraph, by 1852, there's already 23,000 miles of telegraph lines crossing the country. So communication has vastly changed by the 1850s. Manifest destiny, we already talked about that with Polk. And then 1854, we have the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This law allows these two new states, to decide to be slave or free, again, based on popular sovereignty. That's where you allow the local population in that government, the popular vote, to decide whether or not they'll be slave or free. Tensions begin to rise in these states because of it. Well, the Dred Scott v. Sanford case, we've talked about that in the government section, but just a reminder, Dred Scott v. Sanford happened in 1857. The Supreme Court ruling against slaves. Judge Roger Taney ruled slaves couldn't sue the government because they weren't citizens. They weren't even people. They were just property, according to him. 1860, railroads had only been in the U.S. for a few short decades, but by 1860, there were already 31,000 miles of railroads. Most of them were in the north and the northeast, where the cities were, by the way. So after Northern Republican Abraham Lincoln in 1860 wins the presidency, South Carolina becomes the first state to secede from the Union. So that begins the Civil War era. So we're going to stop right there, okay? Because today, sectionalism, we go all the way up to the Civil War. All right, one last map, and then we're going to get into the questions. So again, if you've watched the other videos, which you should have, if you haven't, then you need to stop this, go back and watch the first videos. The first one is colonialism and the revolution. And then the second one is the Confederation and government. And then the third video is the Young Republic and Age of Jackson. And now you're watching the fourth video. So hopefully you've already seen this map. And a lot of this is review of the review. The Northwest Ordinance set the standard for inputting new states into the United States. On the far right of your map, on the far east side of your map, in the goldish brown area, you see the original 13 colonies and the nearby Ohio River Valley. This was all acquired when the United States gained its independence in 1783 at the Treaty of Paris from Great Britain, right? And then you see the white area in the middle. That's the Louisiana Purchase. That was Thomas Jefferson buying the land for $15 million from the French in 1803. And then you see Texas. It became part of the United States in 1845. All of Texas there was, that shape changed over time. We're not going to get into the details of it. We know the shape changed because we live in Texas. It doesn't look like that now. But that was gained, became part of the United States in 1845. It was a slave state, by the way. And then you have Mexican Cession, the kind of pinkish area on the southwest or left side of your map. That was the land acquired from Mexico after U.S. won the war with Mexico, right? We gained all of that land there, specifically California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, parts of New Mexico, Colorado, and even a little bit of Wyoming. Then you have the Gadsden Purchase. That's that itty-bitty, it's really not that tiny in real life, but it's that small area of southern Arizona mostly. That was the Gadsden Purchase. We got that from Mexico just a few short years later after Mexican Cession. Paid $10 million for that land. And then the Northeast, that was gained in a treaty with Great Britain. The United States and Great Britain were kind of arguing over that land. We finally drew a line and decided they could have the area north of it, and we could have the area south of it. So we got that area. It's called the Oregon Territory. 1846, we had a treaty with Great Britain and gained that land. It's not just Oregon. It became the states of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, parts of Montana, and Wyoming. Okay, let's move on to some questions. All right, if you need to pause for a second, get a drink of water, do 50 push-ups, run 10 miles, get your blood pumping, get ready. You can still have keep your packet out while we're going over these questions, because you may want to make some notes on your packet if there's something that's not on your packet that is on one of these questions. We have a lot of questions to do today. So I'm moving quickly, as I said before. I'm going to move really quickly through these questions. I'm going to ask the question, and then I'm going to go straight to the answer. So if you want time to look at the possibilities and choose on your own, because I want you participating and not you just staring blankly at this screen, but I want you interacting with this video in a manner that'll help you remember, then you might want to press pause every time after I ask the question, just to give yourself long enough to choose the right answer. Okay, on the STAAR test, you're going to want to answer the question by eliminating some of the answer choices that you know are incorrect. Today, I'm not going to be necessarily using that strategy because we're moving quickly to expose us to what all the questions were like, okay? Well, let's get started. Here we go. First question, Texas and California. Texas Revolution, cotton cultivation, U.S. statehood in 1845. California, Bear Flag Revolt, gold mining, U.S. statehood, 1850. And then the circles merge and you have a question mark. Which of the following best replaces the question mark in the diagram above? Both of these states were former Mexican territory. Remember, Texas gained its independence from Mexico. California, we received that land after Mexican Cession after the Mexican War. Resolved that our title to the whole of the territory of Oregon is clear and unquestionable, that no portion of the same ought to be ceded to England or any other power, and that the reoccupation of Oregon and the reannexation of Texas at the earliest practicable period are great American measures, which this convention recommends to the cordial support of the democracy of the Union. Democratic Party Platform, 1844. This excerpt provides evidence that in 1844, Democrats supported making manifest destiny an official federal policy. This is talking about we need to gain the land of Oregon Territory. We need to gain Texas. We need to gain more and more land. That is manifest destiny. Uncle Tom's Cabin, Life Among the Lowly. You can see in the small print below that it says by Harriet Beecher Stowe. What was one major impact of this novel? Support grew for the abolitionist movement. Remember, I told you this book was about a slave, and it was a fictional story, but it told about a lot of the real tragedies of slave life. And a lot of white American Northerners read this book and realized how tragic slavery was, and it convinced them to want to abolish slavery. Gold was discovered on Cherokee land. Georgia annexed Cherokee land and abolished the Cherokee government and its laws. The Cherokees refused to move from their land. One attempt to resolve this issue without violence involved which action? Yeah, the Cherokee Nation challenged Georgia's anti-Cherokee laws before the Supreme Court. This is probably more in the Age of Jackson era, but again, good review. They challenged it in the Supreme Court, and we know how Mr. Jackson was. He didn't care about the Supreme Court. He overruled it, and actually we had the Indian Removal Act, and then the Indians were removed anyway. Which of the following reversed the Supreme Court ruling in the Dred Scott v. Sanford case? The 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment gave freedom and rights to black citizens. And before that, remember the Dred Scott case said that blacks couldn't sue the government because they were slaves, meaning they were property of other humans. They weren't actually really citizens or humans. They couldn't sue the government. Well, the 14th Amendment wiped that out. U.S. annexation of blank. Arrow pointing to border disputes between the United States and Mexico, and then U.S.-Mexican War. Which of these best completes the diagram? Well, U.S. annexed, which just means we took it as our own. We took it into, so we annexed it, means we brought it into the United States. So Texas became a state. And remember I said that then there was these border disputes between Texas and Mexico, and this led to the U.S.-Mexican War. 1840s, thousands of Irish immigrants came to the United States seeking to escape a famine caused by the failure of a staple food crop. Staple food crop just means a food crop that is one of the most important and essential food crops that you have. That's a staple food crop. It's an essential, important backbone of what you have in your food. And that was the potato famine, right? A famine, by the way, just means that their food was dying and not being able to grow. In their particular case, I believe there was a disease that spread through all the potatoes. What was one major effect of the opening of the Erie Canal? Okay, we know that the cost of shipping goods from the Midwest, which I told you is not way out west, it's just kind of in the area near the Great Lakes, the cost of shipping goods from there decreased because the Erie Canal, like any other canal, was helping to move transportation and transport goods and products faster and easier and cheaper. The primary goal of the American Temperance Society was to decrease the consumption of alcohol. Temperance just means, and you may want to write this in your notes because I did not write this word anywhere on your packet. Temperance means we want to limit, decrease, or completely end the drinking of alcohol. Which of these was an effect of the Industrial Revolution on women in the early 19th century? Women seeking work migrated from rural communities to cities. Rural communities just means areas that don't have a lot of people. Cities are urban areas with a lot of people. So because of the Industrial Revolution, I told you that many women moved to the cities looking for work, and many of them were seamstresses or would work in the textile or cloth, kind of the same word as textile, cloth industries. Which of the following was a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854? Well, fighting broke out between pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups in Kansas. Remember, I told you that Kansas-Nebraska Act was a popular sovereignty act, meaning the people in those states could vote themselves whether they wanted it to be slave or free state. Well, if all the people could come there and vote themselves, people from slave states would move there to vote for slavehood or slavery. People from free states would move there to vote for freedom, and then there was a lot of fighting that broke out. How did the development of the factory system encourage urbanization? Workers moved closer to manufacturing centers. Again, just like we talked about earlier, women would move into the cities looking for work. People do that even today. We move to big cities because there's more work to be found there. Urbanization just means the growth of urban or city center areas, and that's where manufacturing and industry was. The introduction of interchangeable parts led directly to the use of mass production techniques. And don't get confused by this word. That just means we're creating a bunch of things. We're producing a mass quantity, a large amount of things because, well, we could use interchangeable parts. We could make one tiny little part a million times over and then make another few tiny little parts a million times over and be able to interchange them into the same mechanism or the same product. The Bessemer steel process affected westward expansion in the United States by enabling interstate canal systems to be built in order to transport agricultural goods from west to east. Actually, looking at this one I believe should be D. Railroads to be built in order to carry people and goods to the west. Okay, so disregard that answer there. This one should be D. Railroads to be built in order to carry people and goods to the west. Because even if you don't know what the Bessemer steel process is, which, by the way, it was just a faster, better way of producing steel. And because of that, think about that. If you see railroad tracks, you've got these huge steel, I'm trying to think of the word, rails, I guess is the correct word. Huge steel rails that have to go on both sides parallel to each other in order to make railroad tracks. Well, these tracks have to go out for hundreds and thousands of miles to go all the way up from east to west, and that steel process enabled them to do that to help westward expansion. So again, the answer is D as in dog, not B. How did the plantation system influence the economic development of the United States? It turned the South into a major producer of the cotton used in northern mills. So because of the plantation system, that's where we had slavery, that's where we grew cotton. Well, in the South, they produced the cotton, and then the North, they produced that cotton or changed that cotton into cloth. The growth of railroads during the 19th century affected U.S. businesses by opening new markets for goods. So when railroads grew, that meant now there was new cities and new peoples and new areas that different people and products or goods could get to. So we'd call that a new market where things could move to. So railroads expanded everything, making the ability to get to new markets and get new products to new people more available. As a result of the Oregon Treaty, the United States achieved its goal of expanding westward to the Pacific Ocean. We know the Oregon area, or the Oregon Territory, was on the far northwest, touching the Pacific Ocean, and we finally made it east coast to west coast when we got the Oregon Territory. 1860 census results for selected states. I'm not going to read all of that chart. I'll let you read it on your own if you want. These data could be used to support which conclusion? Again, 1860 census results for selected states. You may want to pause and read through that, looking at that data real quickly before you answer. Okay, here we go with the answer. States in the lower South had more land devoted to plantations. So we could look at that as an example because Alabama and Georgia Mississippi, they were all far south. Kentucky, Maryland, and Virginia they were southern states, but they were further north. So you have to know a little bit about geography to be able to answer this one. But what you can also do is look at the other answers. Again, if there's a question like this, look at all the possible answers and start eliminating the ones that you know are wrong. Okay? And as you can do that, maybe you get down to a 50-50 choice, and then that's much better than a 25% chance at least. So make sure, process of elimination on all of these guys. Texas and California. Wow, we've seen this question before. That means this exact question has been on multiple tests. Texas annexed by the United States in 1845. Settlers attracted by free land. California ceded to the United States in 1848. Settlers attracted by gold. Where these states overlap, that's the question mark. Which of the following best completes the diagram above? Yeah, they were formerly part of Mexico. They weren't both slave states. Texas was a slave state. California was a free state. They both did not border the Pacific. Come on, y'all live in Texas. Texas is nowhere near the Pacific Ocean. California borders the Pacific. Texas borders the Gulf of Mexico. And they weren't, either one of them initially were not dependent on heavy industry. But they were both formerly part of Mexico. U.S. Secretary of War Jefferson Davis had sent Gadsden to negotiate with Santa Anna for the land. Davis valued it, as others did, as the perfect tract for the construction of the Southern Transcontinental Railroad. The railroad line would connect western territories to the east and north, greatly increasing the accessibility of these new lands. According to the excerpt above, Gadsden purchase was intended to support settlement of U.S. territory gained through the U.S.-Mexican War. Gadsden Purchase, if you remember the map, was that little kind of orangish area on the very southern southwest portion. We wanted to use that area to gain more land through or right after the Mexican War. The innovation shown on this photograph most affected the U.S. economy by allowing more efficient movement of goods. Think about this. This is a steamboat right here. This is a boat, a large steamboat. Well, as I said before, these new technologies and new innovations of transportation allowed us to move things faster and quicker and easier and cheaper. Why did the economies of Western territories develop so differently from the economies of the Northeast and South? Western territories had inexpensive land and abundant natural resources. They were inexpensive because that territory did not have very many people on it. Abundant natural resources, we were talking about the gold, silver, different ores and precious metals. The Second Great Awakening was a movement that promoted spiritual revival and the need for social reform. Second Great Awakening was a religious revival that spread through the Christian people of North America in the late 1700s through the early 1800s. And this spiritual revival got them to want to change things in society, social reform, things like temperance, and then eventually suffrage. Suffrage is the right to vote, so they wanted to increase the right to vote to different people. Temperance was trying to get people to stop drinking. John Marshall promoted the public good, maintained a strong sense of duty, used clear language to discuss complex issues. Which actions should be added to this list? John Marshall was a Supreme Court justice. He wrote the Supreme Court decision that established the principle of judicial review. You may want to write his name if you have not done so already, right next to in your study guide. Right next to judicial review and Marbury versus Madison. The county election. This painting of a Missouri scene was completed in 1852. Such scenes would look dramatically different after the ratification of the 15th Amendment. So this one's kind of hard. But let's look. It's talking about an election. The Second Great Awakening maybe not plays a big role in that. Manifest Destiny is the growth and expansion of our country. Maybe not a big role in the election process in Missouri. Expansion of the factory system in the South, I don't know how that would play a role in the election system. The 15th Amendment was giving the right to black men to be able to vote. There's no black men in this photo at the election. Which statement best describes a result of industrialization in the United States during the mid-19th century? Yeah, industrialization caused people to move to cities in search of economic opportunity, aka jobs. What was one major effect of the Erie Canal on the United States in the early 19th century? The rapid growth of cities in the Northeast. The Erie Canal, remember, connected the Midwest to the Northeast, and so it helped produce more transportation and more products and more goods, being able to create more jobs and more market economy there in the Northeast. The Compromise of 1850 allowed certain territories to use popular sovereignty to determine whether the territory would be free or slave. This decision applied to much of the land gained from the U.S.-Mexican War. So remember, popular sovereignty was in places like Utah and New Mexico. After we gained the land from the U.S.-Mexican War, now we try to decide if these areas should be free or slave. Compromise of 1850, the Mexican War ended in 1848. So this one makes sense. We wouldn't do this after the War of 1812 when the Compromise is 1850. That's way later. Revolutionary War was even before that, and the Civil War was after this. So there's only one that makes sense. We have only to look about us in this great city to observe the traces of the deadly influence of intemperance. Everywhere we face crime, disease, and death, all testify to the necessity of the prosecution of the cause, of steadfast and unwavering effort and prompt action to lead to the complete success. Charles Burleigh Address to the Whole World's Temperance Convention, 1853. The speaker quoted above was a supporter of the movement to, we know temperance, to discourage the consumption of alcoholic beverages. That's what temperance is. Which pull factor accounted for much of Chinese immigration to the United States in the mid-1800s? An economic boom in the West. Remember, we had the 1849 was the discovery of gold, so that caused a lot of Chinese immigrants to come because there's a lot of gold opportunities, and there's an economic, so a financial, a monetary, a money boom in the West. Well, railroads were growing, markets and cities were starting to be built out there because of all of this, causing the Chinese to want to migrate as well. Eli Whitney obtains a patent for the cotton gin. Raw cotton becomes easier to process. Cotton production increases. This leads to what? Which of these best completes the diagram above? The demand for slaves increases in the South. We told you before that cotton produced faster, and you could, because of the cotton gin, you could produce more cotton. So you want more slaves to harvest more cotton, or at least that's what the Southerners felt like. In March 1853, a miner from Connecticut, Edward Mateson, and his partners fashioned a 3-foot tapered metal funnel to which they clamped a canvas hose. They pumped water through the hose and pointed it at the hillside from which they were trying to extract gold. What effect did the mining technique described in this excerpt have on the local environment? Well, this is a stupid question, so I'm just saying it. You heard me say it. You're never going to see this on a test again. But the rivers became filled with sediment. The only way you answer this is to just think about context clues. Just kind of read about this, what it's telling you, and then just think about what would happen if somebody shot a bunch of water at a hillside. I don't know what else to tell you. I'm never going to put this on your study packet because this question won't be on there just like this again. Okay, the U.S. population grew from more than 5 million in 1800 to just over 23 million by 1850. The United States experienced financial panics in 1819 and 1837. Land ownership was linked to wealth and independence. The bullet points in this list would most likely be included in an essay about the emergence of manifest destiny. Think about it. It's talking about us growing from sea to shining sea. This is talking about us expanding and growing, bigger population. And the more land you own, well, that means you're more independent and you're wealthier. How did the factory system contribute to the rapid industrialization of the United States? By making the production of goods more efficient. That's what industry and factories are for. We can quickly and more efficiently and easier make more products. This controversial law allowed slave hunters to seize alleged fugitives without due process of law and prohibited anyone from aiding escaped fugitives or obstructing their recovery. Because it was often presumed that a black person was a slave, the law threatened the safety of all blacks. What was one result of the law described above? Northerners who believed the law was unfair began to support the abolitionist movement. So Northerners, this was the Fugitive Slave Act, remember? Part of the Compromise of 1850. Well, these fugitive slaves, the Northerners didn't like this because all blacks in the North, even if they were free blacks, were being hunted down, or many of them, by Southern slave owners. And they did not like Southern slave owners coming up to the North, hunting down people in their own country or in their own states. So they started to reach for the abolitionist movement, wanting to abolish slavery. B'nai B'rith, a Jewish service organization, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, Grimm Brothers fairy tales, kindergarten, meat curing, and sausage making, polka music. Which group was responsible for these contributions to American culture? That's German Americans. New York Daily Times, 1857, March 7th, 1857, Missouri Compromise declared unconstitutional. New York Daily Tribune, March 9th, 1857, the triumph of slavery. These headlines refer to the decision in which Supreme Court case? That's Dred Scott v. Sanford. So here, let's break this down. Dred Scott v. Sanford was the case in which a slave tried, he actually moved up to a northern state, was brought to a northern state, and so in that northern state, he should be free, right? Because he was brought by his owner ended up dying, and it's a long story, but he should have been free at this point because he was in a northern state. He was no longer a slave in these northern states above the Missouri Compromise. If you remember the 3630 line of the Missouri Compromise, everything above that is a free state. Well, he's a former slave in a free state with no owner. Well, he should be free. He should be able to sue the federal government and say, I'm not a slave anymore. Well, this was the triumph of slavery. Slavery won the case. Dred Scott, remember, it would be dreadful to be him. Well, slavery triumphed and beat him. The court system decided that he was still a slave and he had no rights. United States 1850s, you have regional or region, economy, contributing factor. So the North had factories, and the reason they had that was because they had numerous fast-flowing rivers. The South had plantations because they had fertile soil for cash crops. The West, well, what kind of economy did the West have, and what were the contributing factors to it? So which economy and contributing factor best complete this table? Mining, remember, they mined for gold, specifically, is the one that we can remember because of 1849. Well, why did they have mining out West? Well, because they had things to mine, right? They had metal and ores and minerals. Ralph Waldo Emerson, popular essayist and lecturer, promoted individualism and self-reliance. Works included Nature, and the American Scholar. Which movement did Emerson lead? Go ahead and pause this for a moment while you write this down in your notes, because I don't have that in your survivor's guide. It's transcendentalism. Write down transcendentalism and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Transcendentalists were people who had strong feelings about nature. It's often associated with the arts, okay? So writing and fine art. Even if we did not know any of these, we can use context clues to read everything we read here. We know temperance movement is about alcohol. Abolition is about abolishing slavery. The Second Great Awakening, that one might be it, but it doesn't really make so much sense because that's a religious movement. Nothing here is about alcohol, slavery, or religion. So we would almost just have to eliminate all those and choose transcendentalism. So again, good test-taking strategy is going to win the day even when there's times you don't necessarily know the answer. Okay, moving on. Which of the following correctly describes the 3/5 compromise? I was about to read all the answers here. The 3/5 compromise. A portion of the slave population was counted for legislative representation. Talked about this in one of the other videos because I think they had this same question or something similar. The 3/5 compromise was basically that the slave-owning states were filled with slaves. Those slaves had no rights, but the slave owners and the people of those states wanted their population to reflect the fact that they had a lot more people. Anyway, they wanted to say, no, those slaves count towards our population, so we should have more legislative or representatives in the House of Representatives. The northern states are like, well, if you want them to be slaves and they have no rights, we're not going to count them towards your population. Anyway, they argued about it, and this is what happened when two sides argue. They compromise. Each slave in the southern states were counted as 3/5 of a person. They didn't even count them as a whole person. They were counted as 3/5 of a person, a partial person. So you add them all together, they come up with 3/5 of the state's population for legislative representation. Which map shows the boundaries of the United States just after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo? Yeah, so Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, that sounds like a Spanish name or Spanish words there, doesn't it? Well, think about it. That's after we gained the land from Mexico. So we gained all of that area, the area that you see right here in dark, that's foreign territory. We had all of that after that treaty. The only thing we didn't have of all of what you see of our normal contiguous United States here, that's the only part that we didn't have was that little bitty area down there. That's the Gadsden Purchase we got just a couple years later. Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo meant that we got all of the Mexican territory. Valley of the Yosemite by Albert Burstadt, 1864. This painting was completed in 1864, just before the end of the Civil War. At that time, what idea did the Western frontier represent to many Americans? The promise of a new beginning for the nation. By the way, you could look this picture up in color, the original version. It is epic and beautiful. So if we just look at this picture alone without knowing anything else, there's only two things that, there's one here that we know is not correct. There's nothing referencing industrial pollution. This is just a beautiful landscape out west. This said just before the end of the war, what did the idea of Western frontier represent to many Americans? This was long before the creation of national parks. Yes, there's wildlife in this photo, but what were Americans looking for? Remember, we were trying to westward expand, manifest destiny. So this is the promise of a new beginning for the nation. This gives you a hint of this. It's 1864, right before the end of the Civil War. We need a new beginning. So we use context clues here, even if we don't understand it. There's going to be some question on the test like this. You don't quite understand at first glance. Take your time, use some context clues, and try to put together your best answer, eliminating the poor choices if you can. Rapid population growth, economic depressions, the prospect of inexpensive land, foreign trade opportunities. All these pointing to one question. During the 1840s, the factors in this diagram contributed to widespread support for which of the following? Manifest destiny. We just talked about it. The growth of the country from sea to shining sea, growing out west, gaining all the land that we can. All these things point to manifest destiny. Factors that contributed to early industrialization in the United States. Question mark. An abundance of laborers. The ability of capital. Which factor best completes this diagram? New transportation systems. So these other things, this is a process of elimination. The other things just don't make sense. This is the only one that really are part of a factor that helped industrialization. Industrialization is the growing and expansion of industry. I am exceedingly well pleased at coming to this land of plenty. I would advise all my friends to quit Ireland, the country most dear to me. As long as they remain in it, they will be in bondage and misery. What you labor for is sweetened by contentment and happiness. There is no failure in potato crop, and you can grow Indian corn and every crop you wish. I shudder when I think that starvation prevails to such an extent in poor Ireland. Letter from an Irish immigrant to the Times of London, May 14, 1850. Which quotation from this letter reveals the main reason for the surge in Irish immigration to the United States in the mid-19th century? Yeah, the thing that we're pointing out here is there's no failure in the potato crop. He's talking about here in the United States. A letter from an Irish immigrant in the United States back to, he's saying there is no failure in the potato crop over here in the United States. So he's saying, he's urging them, come to the United States. There's no failure of potatoes here. There was a failure of potato crop famine over there, but not here. How did Samuel Morse's best-known innovation contribute to U.S. growth and development? It enabled instantaneous long-distance transmission of information. That's Samuel Morse. Remember the tap, tap, tap Morse code? And he invented the telegraph, or the telegram, sorry. Telegram. I'm mixing those up in my head right now. The telegraph. Telegram. I don't know why I'm mixing that up. Either way, that was Samuel Morse with the Morse code, right? It allowed us to be able to instantaneously transmit information for the first time across the United States. Reasons for passage of the Pacific Railway Act. To aid in the construction of a telegraph line, there you go, telegraph. To provide transport for military purposes, to connect California to the rest of the Union. What was another reason Congress passed this act in 1862? To promote settlement in the West. Think about it. California's out west. We're trying to connect California to the rest of the Union. We're trying to promote people wanting to settle out west. Manifest destiny always plays a role there. Enslaved populations of selected states. You got Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi. You have 1830, 1840, and 1850. Which statement best explains the changes shown in this table? Slaves from the upper South were moved to the lower South to work on cotton plantations. You have to know a little bit about geography here to know that. Alabama and Mississippi were southern states. Far south, the lower South. You see their numbers grew. Tennessee and Virginia were a little bit further north, but they were still south. You see Delaware and Maryland are the farthest north of anything here, and they're slave numbers diminished. Which group was among the first to call for an end to slavery? We know this one. The Quakers, they were abolitionists from the beginning. They didn't believe in slavery because it contradicted their religious beliefs. Building the national road. Trees, stumps, brush, and rock were removed. Hills were leveled and hollows were filled. Layers of stone were laid in graduated sizes. It means growing sizes. Drainage ditches were dug. Which of the following was the most direct result of the environmental modifications listed above? Improved transportation to western states. Expanded trade and settlement. So we continued growing west. That's a big theme here. All of these things were part of a construction process to grow us further west. The United States acquired the Oregon Territory when? Remember the map that I showed you before? In the far northwest, we had a treaty dividing the U.S. and British claims to the land. British got the area north, the United States got the area south, which was the Oregon Territory. Job opportunities in cities increased. Agriculture became more mechanized. Prices of consumer goods decreased. These developments occurred as a result of increased industrialization. More jobs in the city because there's more factories in the city. That's industry. Agriculture became more mechanized. That means there was more mechanical things like the cotton gin. Remember the word gin is short for engine. The cotton engine, more mechanized. There was more mechanical parts and mechanical processes. Prices of consumer goods, so the things that you and I would purchase, went down. It decreased. Things got cheaper because you could produce things in factories more quickly. United States in 1861, you've got 1 over there. You've got a 2, you've got a 3, and you've got a 4. Which region's primary economic activity in 1861 was the cultivation of cotton? Yeah, that's 4. That's there in the South. We know that. Come on, people. We got to have this one. This is the South. That's where cotton was grown. I was the conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years, and I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger. 1904. Who made this statement? Oh, this one's not right. That's not A. It should be C. That's Harriet Tubman. Okay, so scratch that. It's not A, it is C. Harriet Tubman. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a certain book that made people want to become more abolitionist. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Tubman, which is the correct answer here, by the way, it should be C. Harriet Tubman was the former slave woman who now ran the Underground Railroad, which I told you was technically not underground and technically not a railroad, but that's why she's using this as a metaphor. She's saying she's the conductor. She never lost a passenger. She went for many years to the South and freed slaves using the Underground Railroad to get them out. Underground Railroad just being a metaphor for the passages and the trips and the little routes and different people's homes that they used to sneak people out of the South up to the North. Characteristics of California and Florida. Good climates for agriculture, long coastlines with natural harbors and bays, originally inhabited by American Indians. Which of these characteristics also describes these two states? They were former Spanish colonies. California was a former Spanish colony, and so is Florida, even though they're on the opposite ends of our country, right? The cotton gin. How did this innovation contribute to the expansion of the plantation system? By increasing the profitability of slavery. Remember, the cotton gin took the seeds out of the cotton, made it faster to produce cotton that you could actually sell. Well, you needed more slaves to get more cotton to put in the cotton gin. Now you could produce more of it, and now you could make more money. So more slaves meant more money. It was more profitable now for slavery, thanks to the cotton gin. Which of these occurred during early U.S. industrialization? Production of goods transitioned from homes to factories. So people used to make things in their homes, but now with industrialization, the growth of industry, aka factories or mills, people made less things at home, and now they started making those in factories because it was quicker and more efficient in factories. What was one reason James K. Polk won the presidential election of 1844? Well, if we know anything about James Polk, he was a manifest destiny guy. He was committed to fulfilling the goals of manifest destiny. Remember, James K. Polk was the president during the Mexican War, and he kind of started that Mexican War, really, because he wanted to gain the lands of the Southwest. He wanted to fulfill manifest destiny, and that's why he was voted as president, because people wanted the same thing he did. Which of these correctly describes an effect of the Compromise of 1850 on escaped slaves and freedmen? Members of both groups were captured under the Fugitive Slave Law. Remember, I told you the Compromise of 1850 on that chart. It shows that there are 5 things, and one of those 5 compromises of the Compromise of 1850 was that we empowered the Fugitive Slave Law, which meant that Southern slave hunters would go up to these northern states and capture former slaves, and a lot of times they would capture freedmen, which mean black men who were not even slaves. They would capture them, claiming they were runaway slaves, take them back to the South and sell them. As I told you before, terrible law with terrible results. 1830, the Indian Removal Act is signed into law. 1833, the American Anti-Slavery Society is founded. Number 3, 1844, the first telegraph message is sent. Number 4, 1845, Texas is admitted to the Union as a slave state. Which event on the timeline contributed most directly to the outbreak of the U.S.-Mexican War? Your answer here is number 4, Texas. Remember, Texas borders modern-day Mexico. Well, Mexico claimed the land of Texas. So when the United States said, Texas, we're going to annex you or admit you into the Union. We're going to make you a state. Mexico did not like that. And then because of the border dispute there, U.S.-Mexican War started. Between 1846 and 1855, the population of Ireland decreased by 1/3, including the approximately 1.5 million Irish immigrants who left for the United States. What was the primary reason for this migration? Yeah, we know this by now. That was because of the famine caused by a major crop fail. Another one said staple crop. But we know what that crop is. It was the potato famine, right? Worked in California gold fields, helped build the western section of the Transcontinental Railroad, established distinct communities in California cities, faced intense nativism. This list describes the 19th century experiences of immigrants from... Yeah, remember I told you that the Chinese immigrated to California, to the western part of the United States. By the way, 19th century means 1800s. 18th century means 1700s. I know it's confusing. I could go over all the details right now of why that is. It's a reasonable explanation once you know it, but we won't go over it right now. Just remember, 19th century, whatever the 10th century, if it says 19th century, take it back 1. That means it's the 1800s. The Hudson River School artists were influenced by the natural landscape of the United States. This one you could put on your notes because I think I've seen it 2 different times on tests, or you could not. Hudson River School artists were a group of artists that were very much like the Transcendentalists. They were very much interested in nature and natural landscapes, okay? May want to jot that down in your packet if you'd like. Blasting tunnels through mountains, building bridges across rivers, leveling hills, and filling in hollows. Sounds like another question we had. These environmental modifications were made in order to construct a transcontinental railroad that connected the east to the west. Transcontinental means it spans from one side of the continent to the other. What was a major result of the Missouri Compromise? It temporarily relieved sectional tensions. Just like all these compromises, it kind of solved some problems just for a little while they compromised on this, right? Remember the Missouri Compromise? We talked about that, how it put a line across the country, the 3630 line. Everything above that will be free. Everything below that will be slave. So it temporarily settled the issue. Rural populations of the United States. Decade, we have 1820 all the way to 1880. And then percentage, all those listed there. Which factor accounts for this trend? Well, we know rural means areas without a lot of people, right? Not a lot of population density. It's out in the country or maybe small towns. Urban areas or city areas are more densely populated, a lot more people together, right? So as in industry or industrial revolution happened, it encouraged people to pursue jobs in the city. We've seen a lot of questions about this. People moving from rural areas to city areas because of the growth of industry, industrial revolution or industrialism, jobs in the cities. We look at these percentages in 1820 of rural areas. There's 93% of our country in 1820 is rural. Every year that number goes down just a little bit more. By 1880, only 72% of our country lives in the rural areas. So that means more and more people are leaving rural areas, moving to cities. Which of these was a goal shared by many advocates of manifest destiny? Occupying all of North America. If I advocate for something, I promote it, I believe in it, I support it. So many people who advocate for manifest destiny, they want manifest destiny. We talked about that. It's the sea, the shining sea. We own this whole North America. It's all ours. We want it all. 52. Major 19th century innovations. We're almost there, guys. Agriculture, mechanical reapers, combine harvesters, steel plows, grain drills. Industry, interchangeable parts, power looms, steam engines, Bessemer process. These innovations in agriculture and industry resulted in more efficient production of goods. Just like anything with industry and new, better technology, things happen easier and faster and more efficiently. All right, y'all. That's everything. These are just some of the pages that are on the back of your packet, so we won't go over all those right now. You've been with me a long time here. We've went like what, an hour 15. So again, watch all of these videos in order. I think there's going to be 5 total. The first video is colonialism and the revolution. The second video is the Confederation and government. The third video, the Young Republic and the Age of Jackson. And then this fourth video, which is sectionalism. Then the next video is the last video, the 5th video. So there's only 5 of these total. I know they're long, but there's only 5. The 5th video is the Civil War and Reconstruction. Okay, so if you watch these 5 videos, go over your packet, you do all of these 5 videos and you do your packet together and study your packet, you're going to be in good shape for this test. But make sure you do that and you pay close attention. Thank you for sticking with me this long, guys. If you have any questions, contact me. I'm happy to help you or do private tutorials. Thanks.